Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're located today. Welcome to today's Scrum Pulse. I'm Lindsay Vallecina here at Scrum.org, and I'm super excited for today's session. Doing something a little different today. So we're going to be talking about Agile in FDA-regulated environments. And we have with us today PST Jeff Lee, along with Kelly Weyrauch. And Kelly is an expert in the FDA sector, so it'll be really exciting to hear what they have to share. So next slide, please. Okay, some quick guidelines here. So you'll notice that your microphone is muted. That is intentional. However, we do want to collect questions during this session. So please utilize the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you're having any technical issues, feel free to use the chat, but we do want to keep technical issues and comments separate from the Q&A. So please utilize the Q&A for any questions you have for our speakers today. And then if there are any questions that we do not get to, I am going to be sharing them with Jeff and Kelly to figure out a way to address them after the session. And this session is being recorded, so you will receive a link that contains the session as well as a PDF of the slides within 24 hours. So next slide, please. Okay, just a little bit about Scrum.org in case you aren't familiar and you haven't joined us before. We are the home of Scrum. We were founded by Ken Schwaber in 2009, and our mission is to help people and teams solve complex problems. And we do that through our professional Scrum training. We have over 350 professional Scrum trainers globally, including Jeff here today. There to give you your professional Scrum training, and we also offer professional Scrum certification and a lot of ongoing learning opportunities. So please check out our website. There's a lot of free resources, which you're probably familiar with since you were able to find this webinar, but please feel free to check those out. And I hope today's session also plays an important role in that journey. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Jeff and Kelly to introduce themselves and kick us off.
All right, thanks, Lindsay. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So we will start with introductions. So a little bit about me. I started my career as a software engineer. That didn't last really long. I moved into project management, got my PMP, and spent some time in that world before pivoting to Agile in 2011 in my first role as a Scrum Master, which was at a medical device company. And that was the first time I was introduced to the FDA regulations and how we interpreted them. And I found it to be very constraining. It made it really difficult to practice Agile in a good way. And a few years later, I met Kelly, who you'll meet here in a minute, and I found out there's a better way to do it. And we'll be talking through that with you. Currently, I do a lot of work, consulting work, coaching work with a variety of industries, but I find myself in medical device quite a bit. And so I have a lot of practical experience with this. I joined Scrum.org and got my PST a few years ago. And so part of what I do is teach Scrum to not only the broader industry, but also to medical device companies and help them to apply that. So I'll turn it over to Kelly to introduce himself.
Thanks, Jeff, and welcome everybody. A little bit of my background. I'm a consultant now for my own company, Agile Quality Systems. I partner with Jeff and his company to serve some clients in the medical device space. I do basic Agile training using basic mechanisms of Scrum, extreme programming, and Kanban, and the scaled Agile framework, since many of my clients are large organizations that need the additional mechanisms for large teams of teams building complex systems. I also work with medical companies on their quality management system processes. I've got a long history in design controls and risk management. So I help organizations establish a lean quality system, and often a combination of the two, trying to bring Agile methods into the medical device space and aligning the concepts of agility with the regulations and expectations of the medical device regulated world. Prior to being a consultant, I was at Medtronic for a long time, including being in the software organization that made the software that talked to implantable pacemakers and defibrillators. And that's where I was exposed to Agile way back in the late 90s, before Agile was even the term. I was part of the leadership team that brought Agile into mainline development in 2002, and I've been working with Agile teams ever since. Along that time at Medtronic, we were concerned about what regulators would think of our use of Agile for a safety critical medical device system. So we approached the organization AAMI, the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, to get guidance. And what that organization does is provide training and guidance through technical information reports. So that the committee that I got connected to eventually created TIR 45 that we're going to be talking about today. I was one of the primary authors of that document. So you're going to see a lot of that to come in the topics we're going to cover today.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's us, and we'd like to know a little bit about who's here today. Obviously, we can't go around the room for introductions, so we have our good friend Mentimeter here to help us out. So if you can scan that QR code, or if you want to use a computer for this, go to menti.com and enter the code on the screen there. A few questions. So while you're doing that, we're going to ask what industry you're in. You get an idea of where people are coming from. And then the second question we'll get to is what is your role? But we'll be starting with what industry you're in. So go ahead and put that in. I'll share results here in a minute. All right, and just so everybody knows, we'll be hitting this Mentimeter a few times throughout the presentation today. And so if you're sitting there thinking, well, this is boring, I don't want to tell you what industry I'm in, please do, because we'll have some other questions that we want to be getting input from people. So share the results here. We're seeing a number of them here. Healthcare, I see software, dental, diagnostics, pharma, a lot of different areas in that medical space. So for our next question, what is your role? So again, you should have that updated question there. What is your role in the organization? Bring it in so everyone can see this dancing around a little bit. Another good variety, it seems like Scrum Master has the boldest text here. We're also seeing Product Owner, Program Manager, Clinical QA Manager, Product Lead, a number of different roles here, some analyst roles in there as well. All right, good. Well, it sounds like a good variety of people here. The next thing we want to know about is what your experience is in both the experience with Agile and your experience with FDA-regulated environments and understanding of those regulations and standards. So go ahead and you can position yourself as you see on there. All right, interesting mix here. Not surprisingly, at people coming to a webinar from the home of Scrum, we're seeing a lot of people with heavy on the Agile knowledge, some lighter than that, and then pretty broad mix on the FDA knowledge part of it. So, all right. Thanks for helping us out with that. That'll help us to make sure we're structuring this right and hitting the right notes. So a little bit about what we're trying to do today. Our objective for this webinar, as a developer of safety critical regulated systems and software, we want to know how Agile development methods can be used to produce great products while satisfying regulatory expectations. You'll hear a lot of focus on that, right? We want to create great products while satisfying those regulatory expectations. We'll be talking a lot about how we can do that. So our summary and conclusion, you'll see these slides at the end as well. So you get a chance to say, do we hit these? Agile methods do not conflict with the requirements of FDA regulations. You can see some standards on there as well, or other medical device standards. Agile methods often conflict with the quality systems of medical device companies. That's where Kelly spends a lot of his time, is helping people to deconflict these things. And quality system procedures must be adapted for Agile methods. And likewise, Agile methods must be adapted for compliance. That might sound a little sacrilegious here at the home of Scrum to adapt these Agile methods for compliance. We'll talk about that as we go through. I think what you'll find is we hit the way to adapt that as described in TIR 45 hits the principles that we're trying to achieve in Scrum and in Agile. So using the guidance of Amy, TIR 45, which Kelly described earlier, you can and should use Agile methods in the development of medical device systems and software. So our agenda for today, we're going to start with the regulations and standards. Kelly's going to give an overview of the different regulation standards that are at play. We're going to talk about how Agile is set up related to those design controls that Kelly will talk about. And then at the end, how do these things align? How do we align Agile with the medical device regulations and standards? We'll spend some time on that. And definitely submit your questions, as Lindsay mentioned earlier, throughout. We may hit some of them real time. We may hit some of them at the end as well. All right, Kelly, any other introductory thoughts before we dive in?
No, ready to go.
All right.
All right, so this section, we're going to give some of the basic background of regulations and standards. For those of you who said you had a lot of experience with that, some of these things should look very familiar. For those who had no experience, we're just going to give you a little bit of an overview to understand the framework that we're in. There's a lot more to know. So starting at the top, the medical device is governed by regulations. Countries pass laws that regulate the industry. In the US, that's the regulation that created the agency for the FDA that has the responsibility for enforcing the law that Congress passed related to regulating medical devices. So the law is a high-level thing that gives the basic authority to the FDA to regulate. The FDA then creates the regulations that interpret the law. The regulation in the US is this first one, 21 CFR 820. This is called the Quality System Regulation. For those in this industry, know that this is going through some changes now. Earlier in this year, the FDA passed a new rule that they're going to further align with the international standards for quality systems. So the 820 regulation is changing over the next couple of years. We're still going to talk about what the current content is. I'll highlight one of the differences to come later on. The key of the regulation is it has the force of law. If you do not follow the regulation, you get cited for violation of the law. Another regulation is CFR 11, sometimes called the Electronic Signature, Electronic Records Regulation, that has some specific rules for how we manage regulation or records that are created to show that we are satisfied with the law of the design control or quality system regulation. In the European Union, the key regulation is the medical device regulation, the MDR, or the related in vitro diagnostic regulation. These have very similar scopes. The regulations in the European Union go a little further in specifics about products and the processes for them, whereas the US regulation is a little higher level. But in terms of design controls and the elements related to designing products, software systems, the regulations are very similar. Next slide, please. I don't expect you to read this. In fact, I don't want you to read it. I want you just to highlight that this is it. This is the part of the regulation that covers the design of products. We'll talk about some of these specific elements in the slides to come, but the reason for putting this up is to highlight this is all there is to it. There is not a lot of specificity. The regulation is very high level, very broad. The key thing to take away from this is a subsection of 820 called the design controls section, that it describes the elements that govern the design of products leading up to manufacturing and distributing. But the manufacture and distribution is a separate part of the regulation. We're going to be talking today specifically about design controls. So I mentioned the transition that's happening in the world. The next slide, please. The transition is that the FDA is now going to be more formally recognizing the international standard 1345, which is a quality management system standard. It has a similar section to design controls. And again, I don't want you to read it all. I just want to highlight that this is all there is to it. There's not a lot of detail in the regulations describing the controls for design and development. That means there's lots of room for interpretation of how an organization is going to follow the regulations. Next slide. The essence of those two slides, the design control elements in the FDA and the international standard, the essence of design controls is to be in control of your design so that you produce safe and effective products. Design controls describe the controls that have to exist in your development process. Each of those sections that you could roughly see on those pages talks about a specific control that needs to be in place. The regulations do not dictate the development process. In fact, the guidance in the US that you can see on the screen here is highlighting that it is up to the device manufacturer to define what their process is and show how design controls have been applied. This is one of the common mismatches I see in organizations that are thinking they have to interpret the regulations very literally, is they think the design controls defines a process. You have to define your process. You need to define what the elements are, what documentation you produce, how you produce it in ways that demonstrate you have the controls in place. And we're going to talk about several of those specific controls to come. Couple elements of in order to satisfy design controls, these are some of the key principles. You need to be in control and show regulators that you're in control. You have to demonstrate that you are satisfying the regulations, the rule of law. You have to show that what you do meets the regulatory expectations. I often describe these next three bullets in a negative way. What are the three easiest ways to get in trouble with a regulator? The first one is to have a bad product, something that hurts people, that's causing problems in the field. Second way is to not do what you say you do. In fact, not doing what you say you do is a violation of the law all by itself. And the third way to get in trouble is to not satisfy the regulators by giving them what they need to see that you're in compliance. So the positive way to highlight this is have a process, explain what you do, be able to demonstrate it, show that you have good products and that you're aligned with the regulations. You'll be in a good position. We're going to give you more specifics about that to come. So this was the regulations. The next part now is standards. The regulations are the rule of law. Standards are created by international standards organizations that set expectations of what good elements of design mean. So there's several standards that regulatory bodies often look for. The 1345 standard is an international standard, the one I just showed before, that for quality systems. It's a lot aligned with the regulation in the US. But remember, I mentioned that design controls is not a process. They don't dictate the process, but there is a process standard for software development. That's what IEC 62304 is. It sets a standard of what the standard believes is good engineering practices for developing high quality software. That standard was written to be for the scope to be only software that is part of a broader system, assuming that software is either embedded in hardware that drives patient therapy or is otherwise connected to other systems that drive patient therapy. Well, now that there are many software applications that are becoming devices all by themselves, software is the system. That brought the need for the second standard, IEC 82304, that covers health software. The combination of both of those applies to standalone software, such as mobile apps, clinician apps, website portals, things that provide patient information or maybe even guide therapy. The one final standard, just to mention briefly, is there's a standard related to risk management. And by risk here, we mean related to safety. Obviously, safety of medical devices is an important concept. So there's a standard of how to do risk management to manage safety of the devices that you produce. So all of these standards are governed by international standards organizations, expected to be followed by regulations. Go ahead, next slide.
So Kelly, just to press on that point a little bit. So are you saying that do companies have to follow these standards in order to comply with the regulations?
No, they don't have to, but it's a good idea. And then there's a little bit of fuzziness there. To explain that is the FDA in the US cannot require the use of standards. They are not given that authority by Congress, but they think it's a good idea if you do. So if you follow the standards, you are aligned with the law. In the European Union, it's a little bit stronger than that because the European Union the regulation is written to say that you must follow state-of-the-art practices. Standards are presumed to be state-of-the-art, therefore it's expected that you follow them. But if you don't, you can establish your own state-of-the-art. So you don't have to, but it's a pretty good idea that you do.
Yeah. Very good.
So this is one of the detailed elements of the 62304 standard, the software development standard for medical device software. We are going to talk about this one in a little more detail to come, so I want to explain this one. This is a rough diagram that explains the scope of the activities that the standard defines as good process elements in software development. First of all, notice the gray box at the top. I mentioned earlier that 62304 assumes that the software is part of a system. So it's highlighting here that there are activities above software development that the standard doesn't cover that need to be addressed. The key ones being they call customer needs, or the high-level design inputs, user needs, user requirements, the inputs that you get from your customers and stakeholders of what you want, what they want you to develop, what problem they want to solve. The standard simply doesn't address it. And then related to that on the right is the validation activities that confirm, did you meet the needs that your stakeholders, your customers wanted you to solve? The standard simply doesn't address them. It's assumed that that's done at the system level. The standard also assumes that risk management is done at the system level, not just the software level. So there's a system level risk management activities that need to be done, but there are some software specific elements. That's what the first gray bar or white bar in section 7 is addressing. But the heart of the standard are those boxes in the middle that describe the basic activities of software development. Notice that they're all in a nice little linear model, suggesting a linear phase gate waterfall type model.
Yeah,
The reason for that,
I was just going to jump in, Kelly. This is not the sacrilege part of Scrum. We're not assuming a linear model here, are we?
Absolutely not. But yet these standards look like it. Why do they look like it? Because a linear model is a fine way to describe a process. It makes sense to describe the activities in this order. It's just a lousy way to execute. The Agile model talks about how we execute these activities in an incremental evolutionary way. That's what we're going to cover in more detail in the slides to come. The key elements here are basic elements of developing any kind of system, software in particular. We do planning of how are we going to approach the development activities? How are we going to organize our work? We have inputs for requirements. What does the software have to do? We define the architecture of the software. We have detailed design of the elements of that architecture. We write code, we test that the software works, and we release the software out in the world. Basic activities of software development that this standard covers. But that's not all there is to it. As I mentioned before, that not all software is part of a device. Sometimes software is the device or is the product. And so this is why that 82304 standard was created. Look down at the bottom orange pieces, notice that it has activities, develop and release verified health software. Basically, that's saying, if you dive into the details, follow 62304. But there are some other activities that have to be addressed beyond the elements covered by the 62304 standard. That's what those light blue boxes are. Establishing the high-level inputs, validating that the software meets the needs of patients, that you not only deliver software, but other information to the users about how to use it. So the 82304 standard adds on top of 62304 standard for organizations that are producing software that is a medical device or is a regulated product. All right, go to the next one.
That's all right. No more things to talk about on the regulations, standards, guidance.
But we need more guidance. So the standards also have lots of room for interpretation. So guidance gets created, and there's two sources of guidance. First is the FDA itself. In the US, the FDA provides guidance that they describe as the way they see the world and how they interpret the regulations. Guidance does not have the rule of law. You can't be cited for not following a guidance. You can be cited for a regulation you're not satisfying. And if you would have followed the guidance, maybe you would have satisfied it, but you don't get cited for violations of guidance. Guidance is how the FDA is interpreting things, and there is some room for dialogue, discussion, and adaptation of these guidances. Next slide. Guidance also comes from industry, and the TIR45 is an example of that. The Industry Association, AMI, created this guidance document to describe how does Agile work in medical device software development. There's another set of standards related to the creation of tools or software that is used in your quality system to satisfy the regulation, but isn't a product all by itself. So there's a guidance on how to develop and create those kinds of software applications. There's a specific guidance on how to interpret risk management for software. There's a 14971 standard for risk management. There's another guidance that says how do we interpret that for software applications. Go ahead and jump on to the next one. So again, the TR45 is on the previous slide as this is an example of guidance coming from industry, but it's on the list of what the FDA calls their recognized consensus standards list. What does that mean? First, it's not a standard. Why is it on the list? This list of recognized consensus standards is the FDA's way of encouraging the use of standards, even though they don't have the authority to require them. So a guidance or a standard being on this list is FDA's way of saying, this is a good idea that you follow it. And we think it's a good idea, maybe because we participated in creating it, such as in this case, FDA was on the committee that wrote TR 45. So they participated, they know about it. Some other people have been trained about it. And if you follow it, you're in good position with the regulators. So summarizing all that is the next slide. The purpose of regulations and standards. You might see some of these things recognized we just talked about. So Lindsay, were there any questions in the chat at this point? I wasn't watching.
Nope, not yet.
So
please send your questions in as you have them, folks.
Yeah, we would love dialogue as we go, or comments as we go, and we will have time at the end. Okay, so to wrap up this section, one of the common questions we get asked is, what does FDA think of Agile? And the simple snarky answer is, it depends on who you ask. Because on the submission side, when you're submitting a product for regulatory approval, the general response is, we really don't need to know that you're using Agile methods. On the submission side, they care about the final result. They want to see, how do you know that you have a safe and effective product? What did you do to convince us that this is something worthy of our approval? They're not getting in the details of how you made it. They're looking at, how did you get to the conclusion? Whereas on the inspection side, the quality system auditors, regulators that are auditing your organization, they will have more visibility. But even then, it depends on the reason for the inspection. If an inspector is simply coming in to see, do you have a quality system in place? Are you following the regulations? Can you demonstrate at a high level that you are compliant with the law? They might not get into the details of Agile development. If they're investigating a problem, they might find their way into Agile. If Agile's causing the problem, they will certainly find their way eventually. Or if Agile is part of the solution to the problems, they might uncover that you're using Agile methods. I used to teach a course through Amy that included an FDA representative in the class as one of the instructors, and we would regularly get questions from the class. Do we have to prove this? How do we demonstrate that we've run a daily meeting properly? How do we demonstrate we're in control of our backlog? They get into very detailed questions of how we demonstrate that we are in control of our Agile development model. And the FDA would always ask, why do you think we're going to ask those questions? We don't want to get into that level of detail. The only reason we'll ask about that is if you've given us an indication that there's a problem somewhere. We don't need to be so worried about what regulators are going to think about the low-level details of executing in an Agile way. And then the last one, do we have time for the Menti poll on this one? So Jeff's going to pop up a Menti poll. And I'm going to give a brief description of these common problems that we see in aligning the Agile world and the quality system design control world. We'd like your indication of whether these apply to you. Some common misalignments are, quality systems for medical device development are often very linear, phase gate driven. I like to joke that all medical companies read the same book, hired the same consultant in the 90s, so we all have the same linear model, and we assume that that's a rule. It's not a rule. It's just the way we've decided to do things. There's sometimes other assumptions of linearity, of an order of activities that have to happen. A common one being, I have to have requirements approved before I execute tests. That's not a rule. That's an assumption. That's a rule some organizations have made. Regulations don't say that. We're often focused on producing documents as opposed to doing good work that produces documentation. Documents meaning PDFs, Word documents in a file cabinet, virtual or physical, as opposed to documentation lives everywhere in model development tools. A big bang development assumes we're creating all these documents as if we wrote them all from scratch, as opposed to incrementally. Quality systems often either ignore it or flat out preclude the creation of incremental pieces of evidence. There's a lot of emphasis on the word formal. This counts for regulations as opposed to what? What's the opposite of formal? We often see this challenge. There's often an extreme view of independence, that we separate designers from testers. Testers can't talk to designers. They have to be independent, or we have to have lots of independent reviewers. There is a regulation that talks about independent review for one piece of a design control, but some organizations go way too far with that. Sometimes there's an abundance of oversight, lots of approvers who feel like they need to control development as opposed to leaving that authority up to the team doing the work. And finally, sometimes too much focus on satisfying some mythical auditor as opposed to let's do good work, which will satisfy an auditor. So I hope those quick descriptions made sense. What was our result as people were clicking as we were talking through some of those?
Well, some definitely rose to the top. The focus on documents is a very common theme. Focus on auditors and what they're going to need, I see a lot of. Yeah, the phase gates are there, overabundance of oversight. We're seeing a lot of common themes here, Kelly, and it's hard to pick out just one, although the documents definitely rise to the top.
All right, I hope that sparked some thought in the audience of, yeah, we have some of these challenges. How might we get over them? So that's our next section. Let's lay some foundations about how Agile can address some of these elements. Take it away, Jeff.
All right, absolutely. Well, for those of you who've been spending any time with Scrum.org in recent months, years, you know that Scrum is very product focused. We talk a lot about our product operating model, what that means, but moving to products versus projects. And in the medical device space, it's usually pretty easy to know what our product is, more so than some other industries. And product is a thing that exists. It has an inception. At some point, it'll be retired. But that's kind of the big box around here, is talking about what a product is. For each product, we'll be doing multiple releases. Right? So releases have certain things that are associated with them, but it's a version of our system, right? It might have hardware changes, might have software, firmware changes, corresponding documents, as we just saw on the last slide, a lot of documentation, but something that's like, this is a state, we're releasing it to the world. Within that, we can have increments, right? So like kind of intervals before we release it to the broader world, but we want to get things lined up together. What is an increment? I often get that question. It can be a lot of different things. It can be a sprint if you are getting everything lined up at the end of your sprint, right? All of your documentation, your integration, all these kinds of things. You might do it less frequently if that's too burdensome in your organization. Those of you using Scaled Agile Framework might be doing that at a program increment or planning interval, as it's called, level, where it's happening over the course of multiple sprints. Or it could be assigned instead of like a certain time box that you're going to have an increment, maybe a big feature gets done, and we want to make sure that everything is lined up accordingly. So that can be happening many times for a release. Or maybe not. Maybe that you're just doing that at a release level. And then the smallest unit, as all of our Scrum people are well acquainted with, are product backlog items, right? These very small changes that we're making all of the time. So our product backlog is a list of these things. They should be small enough to get done in a sprint. A couple of things I want to touch on here. The difference between acceptance criteria and definition of done. Many of you know this, but acceptance criteria, what we're talking about is the functionality. So we have this small piece of functionality we're calling a product backlog item, and we're going to get it done, and now our product does something it didn't used to do, right? That's the requirements, that's the acceptance criteria. Definition of done is something else. So definition of done doesn't just mean that it does the thing we want it to do. Definition of done is talking about those quality steps that are associated with what we do. So has it been tested? Has it been peer reviewed? Have we updated our documents? Those kinds of things. It's going to be different for every environment. Maybe for, teams will be different even within the same company, but we will be focusing on definition of done here and how that applies to satisfying these quality controls. So what are the activities that are associated with each one of these levels? Some of it happen at the product level. Kelly was talking earlier about like risk management that's happening at our product level. We have a roadmap. We should have a vision for our product. So we have those high level things that are going on at our product level. Within that, for every release, we have other activities that we need to do. So final document approvals, right? If something's going to be submitted to the FDA, we need to do that. We'll have regression tests, other kinds of things that happen at a release level. So we have confidence that what we're producing and releasing to the world is of quality. Going down to that increment level, again, that's that those synchronization points within a release. Again, we might be doing documentation reviews. We could be running some regression tests, whatever it takes in our environment to say, yes, we're at a point that makes sense. Let's keep working on the next big thing toward our release. And then the smallest level again, the product backlog item. Now note the words here. Most activity happens one change at a time, right? We know that from, in the software world, we're writing code, we're doing testing, all those kinds of things that are associated with a product backlog item. But we also need to be thinking about the other things, right? Updating our documents, like Kelly was talking about earlier, incrementally getting things to done. And so if our definition of done includes those quality system steps, we're going to be much better off as we move. I think a lot of us who've worked in medical device space end up at that release level where you have a really long tail. What we're trying to do with Agile is get rid of that tail, get things really done incrementally, so at the end we don't have that much work to do.
I want to highlight one other element of the small bits and the increment release bits. One of the worries of incremental development is you do all the little bits at a time, and you're focused on the small pieces. How do you know it all came together right? Or we break things up into little bits and we decide what order to do them. Is there a right order? Part of the increment and release concept is to say, put emphasis on, did everything come together properly? Did we complete everything? And regardless of the order we took to get there, did everything line up by the time we were done? That's the purpose of the increment and release levels, to put that additional control of, it isn't just about all the small pieces. We have to say, is the big set complete and consistent?
All right, so let's talk about how we get these things to line up, right? So we talked about the Agile model. Before that, Kelly talked about all these regulations. And specifically, you remember this slide, IEC 62304, with this thing that looks like a sequential model of activities. But let's talk about how we do that in an Agile way. So as I go through this, I want you to think about what levels these different things belong in. So when you look at planning, that big line across the top, development planning, does that belong at a product level, a release level, an increment level, or a backlog item level? For those of you who, again, who are well-versed in Scrum and Agile and know that we don't plan well, so we plan all the time, you probably won't be surprised that it's all of them, right? We are planning all the time. We're planning our product. We have a vision for each release. We're doing certainly a lot of planning on how that release is going to go and what's included in it, also at the increments and backlog item levels. So requirements analysis. A couple key places where we see that. At the product, what is from a big picture, what functionality, what's our roadmap look like? Where are we going with this thing? But then each product backlog item we're planning out. Our developers are doing that within a sprint in the Scrum framework. Architectural design, it's going to go in the same place, right? We have high level, we have an architectural roadmap likely for our product, where we're going this in the long term, but also every backlog item, we need to understand how it fits into that. It might be making more changes. Detailed design, we're definitely doing that at the product backlog item level, right? Understanding what the design is for this thing. I'm going to go through a few of these a little bit quickly here because they're pretty obvious here. The software unit implementation and verification, so developing and testing, of course, we're doing that at the product backlog item level. The next one here, integration testing. This is where a lot of companies, I think, need help to work in an Agile model because of where they put that. We're putting it in a few places. TIR 45 puts it in a few places, right? We should be doing this with every product backlog item. The more we get integrated and the more we have that tested, the more Agile we are, the more we can say we're done. But it's likely we'll have some more things to integrate with, especially if we have a complex product that involves hardware, firmware, software, that we might have to do at an increment and a release level. System testing, same thing, right? We should be doing this with every product backlog item in every sprint, but we will also have some things to do at those higher levels. And then finally, our release, kind of an obvious answer there, goes with the release. So the key point here is the more things we're shifting left, right? The product backlog item, everything that we can get done with the product backlog item to satisfy those design controls, we're going to be more agile. We're getting done. We can pivot. All right. So Kelly, sounds pretty simple, right? We just do it all at that level and there we go.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not quite that simple because there's a few key concepts that aren't addressed in that initial animation. That animation in the slide that Jeff showed comes from TR45 that describes it in some detail, some of the things that Jeff just described. But there's another important element that's also from TR45 that talks about how documentation gets created. That it describes that we build up these artifacts of documentation little bits at a time, and we aggregate them into the bigger bits, the collections. So what this picture is describing that for any kind of documentation, whether that's code or design artifacts or requirements artifacts, test artifacts, any kind of documentation that you're creating, you create little bits of that documentation, a backlog item at a time. And within that backlog, you create the piece of the documentation, you put it under version control, you approve the piece to say this content is good. But there's also value at some point of aggregating the set. I don't like anymore that the TR uses the term document because it isn't necessarily a PDF or a Word document. There's an aggregate assembly of information that says this set of stuff goes together. So the best example of that is a document such as a requirements document. We have individual requirements that we develop and approve a backlog item at a time. But at some point, we want to say, do we have all the requirements? Do we have everything we need? Is it complete and consistent? We assemble the set. We version control that set, and we approve the set as a set. The approval of the content happened little bits at a time during the backlog work, but the approval of the document is simply saying, we're comfortable with how all those parts got created, and we have everything we need. So what does documentation look like? Oh, excuse me. It could be paper. Nobody does that anymore. We have electronic versions of paper, PDF files. They go in a doc control system. Excuse me. And these are governed by the Electronic Records Regulation, Part 11. It may be reports extracted from electronic records. We have a requirements management tool. We barf out a PDF that says, here's all the requirements, and we put that PDF in a doc control system. So you have choices of what the documentation actually is. So next slide.
Yeah, it sounds like from our Menti poll, our group is very heavily focused on creating those documents, yeah, in many forms.
So now that picture with the animation that Jeff showed before needs to add this element of documentation creation. So it's a similar pattern, but with some additional information. So let's step through the first step. Planning, no difference, what we just talked about, done at all levels. But requirements is where the difference starts to come in. Notice that we have boxes now for requirements in the increment and release layer. This is that aggregate documentation piece. What Jeff described before of part of defining the backlog is we're defining the requirements. Maybe we put them as acceptance criteria in the story. Maybe we actually wrote something in our requirements management tool. We write them and approve them at the backlog item level. Maybe we do a spike to define requirements. Maybe defining requirements is just part of developing a piece of functionality. But at some point, such as the release point, we're ready to ship a product. We want to aggregate the set of requirements that relate to this product and approve the set because that's what we're going to use in a regulatory submission. And maybe we incrementally create that document so that that final approval is easy. And then the same pattern goes on for architecture, same concept. We evolve the architecture as we go. We create little pieces of architectural design. We update our models. We update a section of a document. And then we have an aggregate approval of the complete architecture description at a release point, maybe incrementally. And you see this same pattern for all of those. So go ahead and step through the pattern. You'll see this common pattern of we do the little bits of activities in document creation. We aggregate them together at increment points and release points. And you end up with this more complicated, multicolored picture that describes how Agile approaches the quality system design control elements. All of these examples were following the 62304 process, assuming software, but the same concept applies to other development activities of systems. If you think of an electronic system, we have the requirements for the electronic subsystem. We have design elements for that. We have implementation things such as manufacturing specs, schematics, things that are used to produce the physical product. All of those activities can be done in the same model. What can we do little bits at a time, a backlog at a time? What is the aggregate set of evidence that we conclude with when we are finished with a product.
Yeah, so going back, I want to give a little story about, I mentioned earlier, my first experience as a Scrum Master was with a medical device company, and it wasn't seamless for me. Part of the problem was what we did is we started with our requirements and our architecture documents. And before we could write any code, we got them signed off. And then we implemented kind of an iterative process to build the things that we already signed off that we were going to do. Well, of course, what happened, everyone who's familiar with, working in Scrum and in a complex environment, things changed. And what we ended up building was a little bit different than what we started with. And we weren't focused on this whole idea of definition of done of all these elements for every backlog item. And so we got to the end and we had to reconcile what we actually built versus what we signed off to begin with. And we made the changes, and then we had to put documents through sign-offs in a certain sequence. And it was a mess. And the bottom line is we were not adding quality to what we were doing by doing it that way. Much better to use a backlog and build these things little bits at a time and without getting that big sign off up front.
And notice an important concept on this picture. Nothing is implying a sequence of activities. That the activities of creating a backlog item and delivering it, and the activities of doing an incremental creation of evidence, there is no implied order of activities. So what is the right order? The simple answer is it depends on the context. There might be times when defining requirements is the thing you ought to do first, and you ought to write them down and approve them. There might be times that, well, we have an idea of what we want to deliver. How about if we design something because we're not really sure what it ought to look like? Let's build something and get feedback on that. So the first thing I'm going to do is write some code. Or maybe it's, I don't know how we're going to prove that this thing works, that we have an idea of what we want, but how are we going to demonstrate it? So the first thing we should be thinking about is, how are we going to test this thing? Rather than describe things in terms of requirements, maybe we describe it in terms of the tests that we're going to follow. That's test-driven development. There is no one order of activities. You have to decide what the best order is and incrementally say, no matter what order we picked, everything came together properly. Everything lined up by the time we were done.
All right, so let's see. Summary and conclusion. I told we were going to come back to some of these slides. Kelly, you want to wrap this up?
So again, our reminder here of our objectives. I'm hoping what we've given you is some more guidance of how you can, in fact, take advantage of Agile methods while aligning with regulatory expectations and rules. The conclusion of we highlighted a few things. There's nothing in the regulations and standards that conflict with Agile. There's implications, there's assumptions, and those assumptions are often built into your quality system. So if your quality system has things that conflict with Agile, you have control over changing those. And finally, you need to adapt to make it work. Your quality system has to support incremental development. If you use the guidance of TIR 45, there's something that the regulatory bodies know about. It's a strong, powerful guidance to say we are in control of how we do Agile development. Follow the guidance in the TIR, you'll be in a good position with the regulators.
All right, so we can get to questions here in a minute. I do want to let people know that if this is an interesting topic to you, of course, reach out to us. I'll have our contact information on the next slide. But we do have a course on this, a 2-day course. So this is a 1-hour webinar. So we hit a few of the key points. But we do go into a good amount of detail of what the regulations actually say, the standards and guidance, and then how to apply it, number of factors, sequence, those kinds of topics that we'll hit on that really follow TIR 45. So if you're interested in that, reach out to us. We could talk to you about that class. A lot of organizations get a lot of value out of it when you get a cross-functional group in there who actually have the power to change the quality management system. It can be a bit transformational for companies to enable Agile development while complying with regulations. So and that class was developed in conjunction with Agility IRL, my company, and Kelly's company, Agile Quality Systems, like you said, based on TIR 45 that Kelly not only was one of the lead authors on, but also is still involved in maintaining that. So the other thing, just wanted to share our contact information. Feel free to email us or hit the QR code if you want to connect with us on LinkedIn. And Lindsay, we'll toss it back to you at this point, see if any questions have come in.
Okay. We have a few here that we have time for. So a quick one here. Someone had asked if there's a tool or Jira plugin that is configured to handle not only software development, but SAMD process as a whole.
Jeff, can you put to that multicolored slide up to talk to that one?
This one?
Yes. So Jira is a very good change management tool. It's a pretty good and probably even getting better as a backlog management tool. And so the key to incremental development is you need tools to support it. I don't know how many of you were, if you saw this picture for the first time, if you're thinking, wow, this is overwhelming, or if you followed along what we were describing, you think, yeah, there's a lot going on here. Incremental development is more complicated. One of the benefits of linear development is it looks simple. It seems easy to manage. It's also not real. This is more real. But so to manage the complexity, you got to have good tools. Jira is an excellent change management tool. It can be used to manage backlogs as well, but you need other tools as well to plug into other tools. You need tools to manage requirements. You need tools to manage source code. You need tools to manage test creation and test execution, and any other activities that you have in your development process. You need good tools to manage it, and they need to integrate together. Jira is particularly good at connecting to other tools, but there are other tools that have similar capabilities. Azure DevOps has some of the elements. The Codebeamer tool is another good one a couple of my clients are using. So there are tools that can help support this. The question about the SAMD process as a whole, you need to define what the process is and build the tool to support the activities in your process. This picture is just an example of software activities.
Okay. Thank you. I hope that was helpful. So this question here, does it matter the order that activities are performed? My process requires requirements to be approved before starting work.
Yeah, we touched on that a little bit before, right? The order of activities. Yeah, and it is your process, right? It's your quality management system that is dictating that. As we talked about, the regulations, the standards, they don't force that sequence of activities, but you need to do what you say you do.
Yeah, I want to echo that one. This is one of my favorite hot button topics. And when people say we have to do things in this order, I says, well, who said that? And we often blame it on the regulators. And I challenge back, there is nothing in regulations that demand an order. We get into a lot more detail about this in the CARS course. But that's a rule that somebody made up, probably for good reasons, in a way that maybe fit a more linear incremental or linear model, doesn't fit well with incremental development. Incremental development says there is no one right order. So that's an example of a rule you might have to change.
Great, thank you. This next question here, my organization thinks the FDA expects us to have a linear development model with phase gates. How do we get over that assumption?
And that's kind of related to that snarky joke I made at the beginning of we all followed the same process. We hired the same consultants, read the same book in the 90s. We set the expectation that things are linear. FDA is used to that. Many medical device companies talk about their phase review system. And so they're used to it. But it's not in regulations and standards. That's choices we made. So if that's what your organization is used to, that's what your regulators are used to, you might have to do some readjustment and get aligned with your regulators that we don't have that linear model all the time. We have a different model, and you need to be able to explain it. But it's to challenge where those assumptions came from. Did you create that for good reasons, or did you think somebody said you had to? Regulators didn't tell you had to. We all just assumed that.
One of Kelly's favorite questions to ask when hearing that is, where does it say that? Show me. Show me where it says that in the regulation, in the standard. And that usually results in, well, you know, everyone knows this. I don't have to show you, but it's not there. So it does kind of get to the heart of it to understand what's really there.
Okay, awesome. We have another question that came in. I'm not sure. It's not directly related to medical devices, but they were wondering if you had any advice in adopting Agile in drug clinical trials. You have seen any of that?
A couple of my clients are working with combination products, and sometimes in the one of the key influencers in drug development, there are some sequences of things that have to happen in order to create clinical study protocols. And so there are some expected sequencing of activities based on the kind of work you're doing. This is similar to the manufacturing world, where there is some linearity of creating a design and building a product and doing testing of the thing we built that is more linear in the hardware world. Similar things I see in some of the biologic clients. Jeff, do you have any other examples to add there?
No, I don't.
Okay. All right. I think we have time for one more question. How can we get sign-offs on requirements if they are planned at the product backlog item level?
Yeah, this is another topic we hit a lot in the CARS course. What do you need a physical signature for, and what do you need a different kind of approval for? And so this comes a lot to how you set up your process, right? If your process says you need a physical signature for every requirement before you develop it, well, you're limiting yourself. If your process says this is how we do approvals by pulling in work because we use this Scrum process, and work is, we go through a sprint planning process, and our product owner and our developers work together to decide what to work on. When it gets pulled in, it's approved, right? Much simpler way of doing that. So you don't have to get a physical signature to work on something.
The key
Okay.
element to a physical signature or any signature is the regulation requires someone to be legally accountable for aligning with the law. Those things that declare alignment with the law need to be signed. But if you develop those things incrementally, I don't have to necessarily sign everything incrementally. I need to sign the final thing. Whether you sign things incrementally, it's a choice you get to make.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I think we're pretty much at our time. I want to thank you both, Jeff and Kelly, today for this great session. I think the audience got a lot out of it. It seemed like everybody stayed on the full time pretty much. So thank you, audience, for tuning in. And if you have any follow-up questions or anything like that, please feel free to reach out to Jeff and Kelly. They had shared their info. You can reach out to them on LinkedIn. And please stay connected with us. So please stay connected with us on social media. And we run these Scrum Pulse sessions a few times a month. So please check them out at scrum.org/webcasts. And we hope you have a great rest of your day, and Scrum on. Take care.
Thanks everybody for joining.
Bye, everybody.